turn it over to you, Anita. Welcome.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here, an honor to be here, really. And I'm very excited to talk with you about the Pi Squared project that Hannah just briefly mentioned on private innovation in the public interest. And today's topic is triumphs and disasters. We're going to be talking about how public agencies have engaged with companies, doing two deep dives into case studies on Toronto and on Tulsa, Oklahoma, and one of which is a triumph and the other of which I'm going to declare a disaster, and talk a little bit about what we can learn from these two case studies about how to be effective. So let me just put out there that every time a retail store charges sales tax, and we have a picture here of a cash register to represent that, the private sector is working with the public sector at some level. And similarly, on the lower right, we have this nice public servant looking at a computer and a printout. A public agency that relies on computing and software is engaging with the private sector if the computer was built by a company and the software was built by a company. So the relationships between the private and public sector are incredibly pervasive. What I want to talk about as our focus here today, particularly, is innovation initiatives. I'm talking about longer-term projects that extend over a period of months or even years, in which companies and public agencies or public facets of public government are seeking to accomplish something together that they can't do alone. So I'll sort of develop this a little bit as we go forward here, but the idea is that two sectors, representatives from the two sectors, are engaging in some sort of initiative to try to accomplish something that they can't accomplish without each other. Here we'll have three sessions on this. Today's on triumphs and disasters. Next week, same time, is on turning problems into opportunities, and I'll explain a little bit more about that in a few minutes. Then finally, we'll talk about sustained excellence, how you move beyond just engaging to sustained excellence. So let me get into the substance of this. This is a picture of part of Toronto, Canada's waterfront. It's called the Quayside area. It's 12.5 acres. It's right on Lake Ontario, so it's really prime real estate here. Right now, it's packed dirt. It's mostly being used for parking lot. It's kind of an abandoned sort of shipping / industrial distribution area that is owned by the city of Toronto. It's 12.5 acres. The case that I wanted to ask us to focus on begins in 2017. So in 2017, the city of Toronto created an agency called Waterfront Toronto to set out a request for proposal for the development of Quayside, this 12.5 acres here. 3 bids came in, and the city chose a proposal called Sidewalk Labs, which was developed by Google and Alphabet, and it was led by a guy named Dan Doctoroff, and it was amazing. It was so slick. Here's a picture from part of the vision for Sidewalk Labs. You know, we're talking here about low-cost housing, retail, covered sidewalks, heated sidewalks, comprehensive data gathering and surveillance. Now, this is a key part of the proposal for Google. They were going to be tracking everything that was happening in this area. And, you know, look at this picture. We've got, you know, dogs flying kites, and it just looks idyllic, and it's a complete transformation. The launch of this was a big media blitz with Justin Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, you know, at one of the flagship events. And yet the news coverage on this, you know, very quickly moved to controversy. So let me see if I can actually make this work. Hannah and I were working on this a little bit a few minutes ago here. I want to show you a piece of news coverage from the launch of Sidewalk Toronto.
Biggest city. It's been put forward by Sidewalk Labs, the subsidiary of Google's parent company. And along with big promises, it's creating a big controversy. Scott is here with the details. Okay, Scott, walk us through this huge development that's been proposed.
Yeah, big really is the word here. It's gone all the way from 5 hectares overnight to 200 acres. And so this is catching a lot of people by surprise for this. There's also, this is incorporating a lot of the unused portlands, pretty much a large portion of the remainder of what's on the Toronto waterfront. Take a look at the map in particular as far as what Sidewalk Labs is proposing and what they want to do. Take a look at the area right here. But one thing that is consistent with all the bells and whistles they've promised over the last couple of years, the Sidewalk Labs, they want to build it from the internet up. They want Wi-Fi everywhere, cameras, data collection, tracking every move, heated sidewalks, time constructions, 89% reduction in greenhouse gases. But what is interesting here is in this 1,500-page report that was unveiled, is looking to develop this further area here, 200 acres in total. So instead of putting money down, Sidewalk Labs is sort of promising the benefits to the people of Toronto and Canada for that matter, what is going to happen in the future with no money down. Take a look at what they're proposing specifically. 77 hectares here, so that's basically the size of a good-sized farm. Most of it remains on the port lands. They're also promising 44,000 jobs, even more with the construction and full-time jobs than that. They're promising 53,000 residents will move in, some rental, some below market costs. But the big promise is, rather than putting money down to purchase this property, they're saying in the future, the people of Toronto and Canada could be the benefits of $14.2 billion of annual economic impact by 2040. Also $4.3 billion in annual tax revenue by that time as well. But for this to go through, they need approval by the year 2020. So a lot of politicians are saying we're not seeing a lot up front for a lot of promises.
So I'm going to stop it there. You get an idea. They're promising this gigantic, project. They're not, they don't want to have to actually buy the land. They want approvals without actually buying land for jobs, 44,000 jobs, 53,000 residents. And a key piece of this is they're doing it on a land grab really for 200 acres where the original agreement was only for 12 and a half acres. And they are demanding that they get approvals for this by the year 2020. So let me go back and kind of give you a sense. I'm wondering, Hannah, whether or not people think this is going to be the triumph or the disaster. Maybe you can make your guess in the chat, Hannah, and you can tell me what people think here. But let me roll forward here as people vote here, just to update you. So in 2020, May 7th, here's the Quayside area, the original 12.5 acres. Sidewalk Labs cancels the plan. So this turns out to be the disaster that I promised you. They canceled the plan to build this high-tech neighborhood in Toronto. And a key point here is that the project didn't have a full government sign-off here. Yeah, there's all sorts of articles that are being written about this. This one says that, Alphabet bet big and Toronto was the problem. Toronto didn't want to play along here. We've got the other side as well being represented. There's some journalism that's ascribing putting the blame on Sidewalk Labs, saying that they failed in Toronto because they didn't play the game right of trying to get those approvals. There's a question about what's next. They talk about the downfall of the Smart City project and how COVID-19 may have played a part in this. And I want to share with you also that the city of Toronto became obsessed with this failure. There was a play that became a sort of kind of crescendo event for the city called the Master Plan that sort of made fun of and told the story of Sidewalk Labs. And Dan Doctoroff is portrayed as someone who was kind of a media darling, who was extremely charismatic. He was the Google executive that was put in touch with this. Go ahead, Hannah, was that you?
No.
Nope, I'll continue here. There was an amplification of the conversation about that. This is a picture. It seemed like every story that came out got greener and greener and greener here. It was an argument that came out in the news that Toronto wants to kill the smart city forever. There were all these objections about data gathering and privacy. There was coverage in Forbes saying 9 things we lost when Google canceled its Smart Cities project. And that includes basically, all the data and analytics and its implications for fighting crime and preventing crime. There was supposed to be a tech playground that came into Toronto. Google was supposed to have its Canadian headquarters here. There was supposed to be fully integrated public transportation, all these jobs, green city initiatives, and of course, data sharing. So the bottom line here is, there were a lot of problems, even from the beginning, with Sidewalk Labs that played out over these 3 years. 12.5 acres versus 200 versus eventually all the way up to 350 acres that Google claimed were essential for this project. Google was not putting any direct money in and making claims that it would be spending first 13.5 million. Then all of a sudden we are hearing about 1.3 billion being invested, but not by Google, by housing developers. And then eventually a $4.3 billion tax benefit for the city of Toronto. But all of this is very much out in the future and is not money that, is assured by any means. Here, there's an argument that there's going to be 14.3 billion in annual economic growth. Everybody was talking about privacy and worrying about, ownership of Canadian information by an American company that was unregulated in its practices. And, overall, there was a kind of a cultural disconnect. So Google is producing like a 1,500-page glossy report, even before it had permit approvals. The culture of Toronto, having lived there for nearly 20 years, I can tell you, is not a flashy culture where you do this kind of thing and you go and make claims in the media. The culture of Toronto was one of engagement and dialogue and relationship building before you make any big proclamations. And so there was a real disconnect there. The organizations involved were complicated. So, Google created this subsidiary called Sidewalk Labs. Toronto created a new agency called Waterfront Toronto. They had their own agendas and missions that were embedded within the company called Alphabet and the city more broadly. And there were tensions and questions about the boundaries on their authority and so on. And Dan Doctoroff from Sidewalk Labs Alphabet just dominated the media on this here. So I want to contrast that disaster, and I'm going to ask us in a few minutes to talk a little bit about the differences here. I want to contrast that with a different program from Tulsa, Oklahoma that I'm going to describe as a triumph. And this program is called Tulsa Remote. Here is the website for Tulsa Remote. It by the city of Tulsa. Now, it was originally run by a foundation called the George Kaiser Family Foundation. It started at about the same time as Sidewalk Labs in Toronto. Sidewalk Labs was founded in 2018. This is 2017. This is founded in 2018 here. And here's the essence of Tulsa Remote. If you're a remote worker anywhere in the world and you're interested in moving to Tulsa, Oklahoma, you will receive $10,000 US in a grant to help you make Tulsa your new headquarters and your new home as a remote worker. And you will get assistance with housing, integration into the community, things like childcare, gym memberships, a WeWork station, and so on. The original Tulsa Remote program run by the George Kaiser Family Foundation was rolled out in 2021 to 115 people. Those people were all first introduced, let me pull this up, first introduced to the mission of Tulsa Remote, which was to attract and retain remote workers with skills and passions to make Tulsa a more diverse and vibrant workplace and place in general, and to contribute to the foundation of a more inclusive and resilient economy. The joint project by the city of Tulsa and the George Kaiser Family Foundation was building on a series of prior projects called Tulsa Educare, Early Childhood Education, the Center for Employment Opportunities that the George Kaiser Family Foundation had sponsored over the years. George Kaiser himself was a native of Tulsa who loved the city. He made his fortunes in a number of different businesses, including oil, and he loved the city. He was a leader in the city. He was trusted by local government officials, and he was committed to Tulsa's development. And the plan from the very beginning was shaped very much by a project that GKFF sponsored by the flagship consultancy called McKinsey & Company, that came in and talked about a lot of specific problems in Tulsa. They talked about the economic transition from an oil economy to aviation and then to a military economy. There was a race massacre in 1921 in Tulsa, so 100 years ago, that continues to overshadow the downtown area of Tulsa. It was a terrible massacre where the firefighting forces did not save a predominantly Black area that was extremely economically successful, and the massacre itself has never really been fully recovered from in Tulsa. This history of inequity. The city has poor education, high rate of incarceration, including especially of women, which is unusual even in the United States, brain drain, people leaving, and so on. And this Tulsa Remote program was all designed to try to address the specific problems of the city of Tulsa, which stands in real contrast to what was happening in Toronto. So we have trust built over time. We have GKFF, the George Kaiser Family Foundation, in the role of Sidewalk Labs, and it's a well-known, well-trusted, understood organization in the city. We have the city of Tulsa, not needing to make approvals because there's no ask being made of the city for anything specific as part of the initial proposal here. I've got some notes here in the slides, and I've covered most of this already, but you can see them if you're interested here. Again, $10,000 you get in cash if you're willing to move there as a remote worker. You have to remain in residence for 1 year in order not to have to pay that back. The initial payment was from the Family Foundation, and now the city of Tulsa has taken over the program. It's now up to 700 people a year or so. They extensively studied benchmark programs in Vermont and some other places, including in France. They integrated the McKinsey report with other initiatives on improving the quality of life and the cost of living, like giving you low-cost housing and getting you into a community program and having you get co-working space at this place called 36 Degrees North. And there were events and restaurants. They had 10,000 competitive applications for the first 25 slots, 10,000 applications. These later was up to 100 slots and then 115. They were bringing in people to meet them, to interview them. There were principles of equity and commitment that were used. There were weekend visits. Some people had to come in several times before they were accepted. And there were links to Oklahoma, different state level programs that were available. The timing couldn't have been better because of the pandemic. This idea of work from anywhere was part of the whole proposal. And there was a lot of measurement that was occurring that was both qualitative and quantitative. So, interviewing people in the program and thinking about new business formations. There was an unexpected surge in that. There was a third-party assessment by another consultant that there would be a $51 million return on investment with almost $14 in income enhancement for each dollar invested, but a lot of work that was done to try to make sure that that was accurate, and a real emphasis on diversity, equity, and inclusion. This is all laid out, by the way, in an excellent Harvard Business School case study on Tulsa Remote that I recommend to you, that was written by a number of professors, including Raj Chowdhury, who has written about this in the journals as well. So as we think about the lessons for this, let me pause here for a minute, actually, and ask you, what sticks with you when you contrast this disaster in Toronto with the triumph in Tulsa? What sticks with you as the highest sort of level of contrast that you want to highlight?
And I invite folks to either write in the chat or just, come off of mute and shout out your answer. I see some good responses in the chat. Anita, I'll just read them out briefly.
I can see them.
Who
I've got
might
the
not
chat
be able to
here.
see. So Tulsa engaged stakeholders, trust built over time, community conversation, specificity, focus
Yep.
on value for the community rather than value for private equity, scope. Tulsa's plan was working to solve a problem. Toronto had very lofty goals. These are
Yeah.
great. Big numbers in Toronto.
Yeah. Fantastic. These are all great, great points. And I see Erwin has raised his hand. Just to react for 1 second, and then we'll hear from Erwin. But just to talk here, just to highlight some of the points that are being made here, which are all excellent. Here, we're talking about 115 people, with each one of them getting a lot of attention in Tulsa, versus a claim that 53,000 people would move into this Quayside area of Toronto, which had, by the way, Toronto has an excess of housing. We have tons of unoccupied apartments in Toronto. So the fact that Google came in and made this declaration that there would be all this available housing was super out of sync with what Toronto actually needs right now. There was also no public transportation by light rail yet available into that area. You were going to be on the bus or the trolley car, which is kind of a tough thing to do in Toronto. So the fact that the plan for Sidewalk Labs for Quayside was not actually very well linked to Toronto's problems is a very relevant one here. I like Jessica comment, what, Toronto doesn't want a sports stadium? That's very funny. Toronto has many, many sports stadiums, just to say. Erwin, what's your thoughts?
Well, having worked in a large public agency, the question that I would ask is, why wasn't the city looking at the opportunity of taking a vacant lot and doing something valuable for the city with it? So you think there'd be a city planning function that would be saying, hey, here's an opportunity, how can we turn it into value? And maybe themselves go after the real estate developers and see what they could do. That might be a better deal than what Google offered. Also, how do you create 53,000 jobs like that? So.
Yeah. So, Erwin, what do you think the answer is? What is the dynamic in a city when a very, very prominent company that's got an enormous potential impact comes to town, puts in an response to an RFP with a plan for 12.5 acres, and then all of a sudden says, we need 200 acres, and we can't make money at 12.5 acres. We need more, and we're going to get more. And they just announced that in the newspaper.
Well, the city ideally would have a better plan already, saying, oh, we already are thinking about alternative ways to use this property, and it can benefit the city in these ways. That's not hard to do,
Right?
so.
Yeah. I mean, here's my final sort of pitch here, and then I'm interested in others' recommendations, ideas, and so on. I think the boxes that are represented on this chart constitute a framework that we're going to be developing in my project on private innovation, working with public sector agencies on how we need to get alignment. And so the first thing is the vision of Google and the aspirations of the city of Toronto were not very well developed, and certainly were not aligned. And I'll talk about that in a couple of seconds, in a little bit more detail. In contrast, for Tulsa, there was a lot of work that was done there. The second thing is we, in Toronto, did not have alignment on who was going to benefit from this. Was it the 53,000 people? Was it the 44,000 people? Was it the country getting this sort of flagship project from this very kind of prominent company that would raise the level of prestige and competitiveness of Canada relative to the United States. What's the benefit for the community? It's very diffuse and very deferred into the future for Toronto compared to Tulsa. Tulsa, it's 115 people and their employers and the retail stores and the businesses that serve them. So much, much more specific, as one of you wrote in the chat. There was no real work done on how we achieve and demonstrate excellence in the Toronto example. There was just a presumption of excellence that was expressed in this flashy report that came out here. And we'll talk in a second about how Tulsa had these real discerning measures of what it takes to demonstrate excellence that confronted Tulsa's history in a way that was very well kind of crafted. Okay, there was no resolution of the resources and capabilities in the one case versus the other, and then there was no real vision for sustainability, how we were going to sustain the economics of the two projects. So if we look at these boxes in turn here, looking first, Google and Toronto did not have aligned objectives. What were Google's objectives? Getting data on 44,000 residents of a big city like Toronto, 53,000, residents, and looking at their Google wanted the data. Toronto wanted the economic development, but didn't really have a kind of plan for the data. And there was constant tension between privacy concerns among citizens of Toronto and Google, and there was constant pushing by Google to try to get Toronto to put money into this project. So that was out of sync. In Tulsa, we had alignment there. The city of the leadership team of the city of Tulsa knew George Kaiser, knew how he worked. There were detailed conversations about the plan to transfer this project over to city control over time, which has occurred in 2023. So, the planning here anticipated the specific problems and issues that the city of Tulsa would need to resolve. And there was the purpose of the George Kaiser Family Foundation is not to enrich George Kaiser. The purpose of it is to make Tulsa a vibrant place to live. And the reason that Kaiser himself cares about that is because he's originally from Tulsa and feels that affinity to it. I also want to point out that Google would never have worked in Tulsa because the city of Tulsa's leadership team, to Erwin's point, was much, much more keyed into the local problems that needed to be solved than Toronto's leadership was at the time. And similarly, the George Kaiser Family Foundation, I cannot imagine that they would have had an interest in investing in Toronto. Toronto is a relatively wealthy city. The problems of the city are extensive, but they're not aligned with the specific agenda around education, diversity, and inclusion, FF. So, we had a kind of sweet spot here between the city of Tulsa and the Kaiser Foundation that allowed an alignment of aspiration. And achieving that alignment is a lot of work, McKinsey projects, conversations, lots of consultation. So there's a lot of work to get alignment. It's not a passive thing that you can take for granted. The conversation about who was going to benefit, who they're creating value for in Toronto was, very, very diffuse, very amorphous. The Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is thinking about economic impact for the country of Canada for this project. You get this glossy photo of a lot of kind of well-heeled folks, with big expensive baby carriages and, heated sidewalks and, dogs playing Frisbee and so on. There isn't a kind of specific focus on, the real needs of Torontonians that can't find housing in this city that has an abundance of unoccupied units. The people of Toronto that need housing at the level that this project assumed have very complex needs, actually needs that may be aligned with the needs of some of the Tulsans that were affected by Tulsa Remote. None of that was on the drawing board for Sidewalk Labs. When we think about Tulsa, we're thinking here about bringing into the community workers that are going to need services from local retail businesses that have been struggling, that are going to get more attention, more engagement, more infusion of excitement and energy, more traffic as a result of bringing in these remote workers. So there's a kind of a flywheel of business, sort of a business opportunity that's developing in Tulsa that's been charted out. So we have this kind of sense that there'll be specific local businesses that are going to benefit from the Tulsa Remote program. There's kind of person by person, small business by small business analysis happening here. So the next piece of this around demonstrating excellence actually points to a problem with the Tulsa Remote program, which is it's not scaled. So what Tulsa Remote is about is person by person, achieving residency, job creation, excitement, engagement, but we're not getting a scaled impact, at least not initially. There's a sense in Tulsa that we have to go through the hard work of figuring out which of the 10,000 applicants are going to be appropriate here and are going to help us rejuvenate downtown neighborhoods that need that investment here. In Toronto, there's just an assumption that a wall of people are going to move into the community, and that's going to lead to jobs and tax revenue and housing development and excitement and data sharing and governance sharing. There's a famous sort of a famous quote that came out of the Sidewalk Labs project that Google was actually going to be more effective at running the government of the Quayside area than the city of Toronto was because of all this data. And that really angered Torontonians for sure. So, you know, it's kind of diffuse scaled argument about technological opportunity on the Toronto side, and on the Tulsa side, it's like a block by block neighborhood building that's going on here. There's also much more reliance on the Tulsa project on private investment and private responses, whereas Google wanted Toronto to just throw this incredibly valuable land into its pocket. So there's a real tension there between public and private infrastructure. On resources and capabilities, you know, Toronto is facing unregulated technologies that Google is inventing for this project around surveillance, data analysis. There's a lack of clarity on the quality of that oversight. There are unaddressed questions about authority and how this data can be used. In Tulsa, there's all this continuing conversation going on about retaining people and understanding their needs and figuring out whether or not the $10,000 is taxable. And, you know, if you're working remotely, where is your income going to be taxed and so on. So there's a contrast on those considerations as well. And then ultimately, the measures of sustainability in Tulsa were around local population growth and job growth in the specific areas of the city that were affected, economic impact in this bounded area. Whereas in Toronto, there's this sort of idea that Google's going to take the learnings to other cities and develop additional waterfront land in places like my hometown of New York. And there's no benefit to Toronto, direct benefit to Toronto for that to occur. So look, when we think about innovating in public and private initiatives, all 5 of these things, which are of course interrelated, have to get aligned and have to be thought through in advance in a way that requires a lot of sustained engagement and a lot of work. And over the next 2 sessions, the one that we have next week and then September 25th, we're going to focus on that. So next week, we're going to be focusing on how do you even begin a conversation with a potential private sector partner on getting those aspirations aligned? How do you think about starting small and growing from an effective proof of concept, how do you identify the value that you're creating and who is capturing that value? And how are you going to make your story compelling around excellence? How are you going to demonstrate your excellence? And that's going to be true for both the private sector actors, such as the mayor of the city of Tulsa, and for the Dan Doctoroffs of this world, the executives that have to sell their vision internally within the companies that they work for. So we're going to talk about, how you actually pull that off and how you build alignment in these three domains. And then on September 25th, we're going to turn to the final two boxes on identifying how you're going to get the resources you need for this, and then finally, how you're going to sustain an initiative like this. So that's what I have for you today. I would love your questions, remarks, reflections, and thoughts. I see we've got quite a bit in the chat already, Hannah.
Thank you so much, Anita. That was fantastic. Let me just take us off recording.